Good morning to all. Welcome, in short, Saturday morning talk about wine as an aperitif. Then our identity is shaped by not only the food we consume, but also the beverages we choose. Thus, Feuerbach, in his goodness, completely neglected that aspect. We are greatly shaped by our choices, and wine holds a vital role in our culture, particularly in the Mediterranean region. It is an essential facet of our civilization. So when it comes to defining wine, we have various options. Pola, kost, leget, or oinos, all of these words can be used. To put it like Plato did, wine is a reflection of existence. Just like being can take on many forms, wine also presents itself in numerous ways. It serves as a metaphor for existence, if you will. And there are definitions. The technical definition is wine is a hydroalcoholic solution obtained through the fermentation of the sugars contained in grape must under the effect of Saccharomyces. This would tell you an oenologist. Luigi Veronelli, who was perhaps the greatest wine writer we have had in Italy, had a beautiful definition and said that wine was the song of the earth to the sky. Very poetic, literary poetic. So between these two things, one very technical and one very poetic, there is all the wine in between. And how wine was born. Wine was born 3,000 years before Christ. There are two probable areas where it was born. One is Caucasus, Iran, and it goes all the way to Afghanistan, even then Middle East. And even a little bit further east than the Middle East, and the other one is in the Mediterranean and then in the Aegean-Cretan area, basically, which then, after many centuries, becomes Mycenaean, and Greek wine was born. Initially, the wine was called Voinos with a letter that then fell off, that was called digamma. And digamma disappears in ancient Greek, leaving as its passage the sour spirit. Anyone who has studied ancient Greek knows what sour spirit is. It is a kind of aspiration that would be an aspired spirit, and digamma was a V. It is difficult to comprehend how aspired could be correctly pronounced due to the fact that no one truly knows the exact speech patterns of the ancient Greeks, similar to our limited knowledge of the ancient Romans. Without recordings, we are unaware of how they spoke or pronounced words. Therefore, this particular term, voinos, remains enigmatic to us in terms of its meaning during that time period. Voinos was a fermented drink, and it wasn't necessarily made from grapes. Mead made from honey was one of the earliest examples of this beverage. Over time, the focus shifted to apples, resulting in the popular cider we have today. Essentially, it's a wine made from apple must. It was made from malted barley in Egypt especially, and it was the lactose fermentation resulted in the creation of alcoholic beverages such as beer made from milk. These drinks were known to be determined by the fermentation of lactose. So we have both an agricultural origin, but also a pastoral origin, we could say, of wine at that time there. So it was a very particular wine. And not necessarily made with grapes, even with figs. It was made thought. Why this? Because who the grapes was, and already a very specific culture. In some areas it was not being... Initially, it seems that the vines were wild, and therefore you could not cultivate them as they were creepers. Consequently, you opted to utilize the existing vine. However, grapes are also the most sugary fruit that there is. So slowly wine is made from grapes because that was the wine that was best, had more alcohol, and having more alcohol meant that it could be transported more easily because alcohol is a preservative. When we put something in spirit, it is to preserve it. So alcohol is a preservative, like sugars are preservatives, like salt is preservatives. Vinegar, etc., etc. But if vinegar is a preservative, vinegar from wine is derived, so we're talking about that. Well, voinos was this stuff here, then slowly, especially in the Greek context, from voinos it becomes oinos. And oinos, what is it? Oinos is grape wine, and grape wine a little bit, we know it. We have a lot of literary evidence of this fact also. because oinos has been sung about by poets like Alcaeus, for example, by great political writers like Solon, and then also in Plato's Symposium there are many, many testimonies. There is a very nice book that I point out to you that is called Poetry and Symposium in Ancient Greece. It is a historical and critical guide by Massimo Vetta. Massimo Vetta was assistant to Luigi Enrico Rossi, who was professor of Greek literature at Sapienza, and he wrote this book in which there are precisely literary accounts of wine within Greek poetry. The wine in Greek poetry, we have it very famous, is the wine of Polyphemus, the wine with which Ulysses gets Polyphemus drunk and then they blind him because he had fallen asleep. But you know, it was made crushed and made in one night, so if we were to stand and see what actually that stuff there was, it was a must that was fermenting. And it didn't have a lot of alcohol because it takes a lot more than one night to be able to finish the alcoholic fermentation. So that was a sweet stuff with a lot of carbon dioxide, and that was probably what put Polyphemus to sleep, not the alcohol. Because the alcohol was relatively little in the wine of Polyphemus. They had crushed it in one night, done racked and so on. But and they gave him a cup of sweet fizzy stuff full of carbon dioxide, and that one there was probably the effect if we want to do a historical reconstruction of something that is legend clearly, because then the Iliad, the Eurasian, it's some very particular. Going on, we have many things, but the fundamental aspect of both the voinos and at the literary level, especially the testimonies, are not about the wine as such, but about the wine for the effects it produced. In Plato's Symposium, the people who discuss together with Socrates talk about love. They don't talk about wine. They drink wine talking about something else, because wine is a psychotropic substance. Alcohol is a psychotropic substance. Let's say they considered it a little bit like psychedelia considered LSD, just to be clear. And that was the point of wine, was yes, to enlighten the mind if drunk moderately, but also to lose it. Think of the Orphic rites, to the Orphic mysteries. Think of everything that was related to the cult of Dionysus or Bacchus in Roman times. Wine was something that was meant to get one drunk and therefore make people lose their inhibitions or make people have particular visions, just like what happened in the IPI generation with certain drugs. That was the general understanding. Wine wasn't valued based on its origin, but rather on whether it tasted good or not. It had to be enjoyable to drink, otherwise it would have been considered medicine. This was the prevailing perception of wine during that time, based on the evidence available to us. So the gentlemen who were the protagonists in Plato's Symposium were talking about love. They were not talking about wine. They were discussing the meaning of love. And think that this, let me make a little aside, they define the genders of people, saying there are 3 genders in people: the males, the females, and the androgynous. So in the 4th century before Christ, they already had. The idea behind this matter is that it was a typical occurrence that you ought to communicate to General Vannacci. Then they hadn't mentioned Sappho, who was 2 centuries before, but I mean, there was this as well. So there was nothing strange here and foreign to humanity. Having said that, how the Greek oinos becomes vinum in ancient Rome. You know, when Flamininus conquered Greece in the 2nd century before Christ, 120, I think before Christ, it says Rome conquered Greece, but Greece conquered Rome. The Romans, known for their love of wine, had little literary evidence on the superior publicans' consuming habits due to the rustic nature of their local beverage. Their drinking rituals involved the precise production and consumption of wine in the same location. The scarcity of evidence can be attributed to the lack of literary resources focused on this specific branch of the publican profession. In the Castelli Romani, there was Veliternum, which was the wine of Velletri. There were wines from those areas there around the city of Rome. Around the city of Rome, there was a lot of countryside. All in all, there is a very hilly strip of countryside. So a lot of stuff came from there. Whereas when the Greeks arrived, the customs, even in the way of drinking wine, become much more sophisticated in all senses. Because Roman wine becomes a wine of type, not of origin. The typology, what was there were the wines looked a little bit like vermouths, the Roman wines, because they were tinned with spices, with honey, even with seawater. The Koo wine there were to make it more salty. And then there were in the festivals and in the most important noble families, the Magister Symposium Arbiter Bibendi, which would be the sommelier of the time, who was the one who determined how many parts of water you needed to cut the wine, because wine was never or rarely drunk alone, but was cut with water. And then it was then served in this sense here. There is also obviously a rituality and a symbology in Roman times. We go back to the rites of Bacchus clearly, and to these aspects that are related to religion. Furthermore, wine has a significant connection to religion, as we are well aware of the transubstantiation of wine in the Mass, a fundamental aspect of our civilization. Regardless of one's level of belief, as Croce wisely stated, the association between wine and religion remains apparent. Thus it serves as a testament to the deep ties they share. We cannot not call ourselves Christians in some way. So I was saying wine also became something symbolic, but why was I telling you typology and not origin? Because in Roman times, yes, there were trades. The wine came from different parts. Meanwhile, the wine that came from different parts was an expensive wine, so it was something for rich people. Think that Mount Testaccio in Rome is made from the shards of Roman amphorae that were the way the wine was transported, arrived in Ostia. The port of Ostia Antica, the port of Trajan, the hexagonal one that is now completely silted up, and so it doesn't flow out to the sea anymore. But there it was, just the point where the big ships that came from Africa, from Spain, from the east would arrive. They would unload their goods. A good part of it was foodstuffs and wine and oils for the city of Rome, and they would be loaded, these goods, on the barges that would go up the Tiber and arrive at the port of Ripa Grande, which was just below Testaccio, after which would obviously the amphorae emptied, put the wine, and there was put in other containers. The amphorae was split. And put in an orderly manner, and by amphora types in a dump, which then became Monte Testaccio. The Monte dei Cocci in Rome is this. And from 60 BC until 250, 350 BC, they created a kind of landfill that was 60 meters high and had a perimeter of about 1 kilometer and something. Consider it, everything presented in a highly organized manner. If you all go and observe it, it is indeed an impressive sight. There is a restaurant under Testaccio called Cecchino's from 1887 that has the cellars inside the Shard Mount, and there you can go and see how they had arranged all the cocci for a kind of museum. In fact, they accept visitors even if they don't go to eat there, because they have to show this cellar, because it is a historical artifact. I mean, it is a very nice thing. This is to make you understand what wine was then in Roman times. It was a very popular thing. It was a very important thing. But then badly, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, the Roman Empire falls and the whole thing implodes. Wine is also an indicator of the economic situation of a period of a country. So, if, for example, the Arabs conquer all of North Africa, nothing comes from there anymore, even Sicily, which was the breadbasket of Italy. Nothing comes anymore, so you have to organize, and so the trade becomes much more local. The typologies, I was telling you why the typologies in Roman times, because when wine was no longer coming from Greece, well, they made wine in Italy that resembled Greek wine, and it was called Greek anyway, because it resembled. And some wines still today have this kind of division. The oldest wines are not wines that are wines that have to do with an origin, but with a system of production. Think Champagne, think Porto, are made, think of Marsala. They are made according to the style of production that is, paradoxically, I could make a very similar wine, and you make very similar wines to Champagne in other places as well, because it is the system of production that determines the characteristics of the wine, not so much the origin. So much so that the French had to copyright so many places for this thing here, not just the appellation of origin, the port ditto. So let's say from the type in all the years of the Middle Ages. Quite a bit, but I mean right after that you get to a definition of wine through origin as well. And origin becomes more and more important. More and more important. Why? Because typologies, that is, a wine made under one production system you can make anywhere, but a wine from one place you can only make in that place, and so that means you defend your tradition, your origin, and your uniqueness also. So your exclusivity, if you will. This is a rather important thing. The transition between typology, between typological wines, and instead wines with designation of origin is an epochal transition that, how to say, covers many centuries. Covers many centuries and is crucial in understanding what wine is today. Above all, then in medieval times, vinum was still vinum. It was not yet vin, it was not yet wine, vigno. It was still vinum, and it was basically made for mass. The monks think there is a town, you probably know it, it's not even that far away, because in Umbria it's called Montefalco. And in Montefalco the vineyards are inside the monasteries, and one of the most important places for Franciscanism, and there were Franciscan monasteries inside the city walls. Montefalco is not a big metropolis, however there were several different monasteries with their vineyard, and the vineyard was inside the walls. And it was used to make a sweet wine that they called Sagrantino, from sacred, because it was a wine for mass. The Vincents that are also made here clearly were Vincents for the mass. And they were sweets made from raisins for two reasons. First, because they kept better. Second, because Vinsanto must not have any additives. It must be a pure wine, a natural quote-unquote wine, if you will. So there must be no sulfur or preservative, no nothing. Because it has to become the blood of Christ clearly. So in short, the blood of Christ with sulfur dioxide doesn't sit so well. But it takes alcohol, it takes sugar, because it takes other preservatives, because otherwise it becomes all vinegar, a disaster. And some Vinsanto, some vinegar has it in it. So it's not that exactly the things in between stories think that viticulture is saved in so many places in Europe. It was brought by the Roman legions because the Roman legionnaires drank wine. It was in their equipment, in their diet, the fact that they drank wine, so they, even in addition to their weapons, their personal effects also carried science to plant vines. That is why there is wine in Bordeaux, there is wine on the Rhine, there is wine in some Danubian areas, because they were not areas where the vine naturally propagated. Let's say you had to plant it because it didn't basically align in those areas. They were too cold there even at that time, where the climate was warmer. So they bring wine, and all this viticulture with the fall of the Roman Empire is at risk clearly, and maintained by monks here and there. Think of the abbeys of Cluny, of Citeaux. If there is Burgundy at the wine level, it is because there were the monks of Cluny, for example, and that maintained vineyards in certain areas where in theory there should not have been. And so many things went on like that, including the amanuenses, including the books of antiquity that were copied. So that's what they did basically, and I would say that the medieval transition is made of local wines and wines that were maintained in certain areas just by the action of the monks of that era there. Let's take a big leap and get beyond the Renaissance, where wine obviously regains a foothold in the courts, especially also because the noble families in Tuscany, but also in Lombardy and many other areas in the Sol Italia, had vineyards in the areas, in Chianti, for example, but also in other very important areas. In Tuscany, everyone was making Chianti, and there was also a wine trade that was called Chianti, in a typological way still. Why? Because if I made a wine that looked like Chianti wine, I would call it Chianti, so who was able to tell the difference? It was a red wine made in a certain way, maybe with the Tuscan government, etc., etc. And so it was Chianti, it was a Tuscan red wine, it was called Chianti. And Cosimo III de' Medici says, no, this is not good, because if it is Chianti, it has to come from the Chianti region, which is the region between Florence and Siena, where there is Greve, Gaiole, and Castellina, where there is the symbol of the League of Chianti, which was the black rooster. On the Vasari, there is a painting by Vasari in Palazzo Vecchio, where there is just as much description of Chianti, where there is Rada, Castellina, and Broglio, not Gaiole, Broglio, which was more important than Gaiole that time. And then because there were already Ricasoli barons in Broglio, so Chianti, he says, has to be demarcated and can only come from this area here, and he defines it. And that's more or less what today is the Chianti Classico appellation of origin area. The one with the black rooster, in fact, which is a Guelph rooster, because it is a Florentine rooster, while the Sienese had the white rooster. If you remember the legend of the black rooster, the two horsemen leaving, the Florentines managed to get him to leave first because they go in with flashlights, where the Florentine Guelph black rooster was so, and they make him sing first, and so the Florentine knight leaves before the Sienese knight. And they meet under the castle of Fonte Rutoli, which has 2 steps from Siena. So that means he had left well before, because think on horseback from Florence to Fonte Rutoli, how long it must have taken him. And the other had left instead exactly when the rooster had sung at sunrise and the Sienese lose. The dominion of a vast area of Chianti, which was much disputed because it was a rich area. They made oil and wine, there were oak and chestnut woods. And with the oak and chestnut forests, they made, among other things, also the ships. So, I mean, besides houses, besides that, it was the building material. And so it was very important to have control of these things at that time. It's not like they were coming from outside. So Cosimo III says Chianti, but not only Chianti, also Carmignano, which is nearby, Pomino and Valdarno di Sopra. And this is the first edict in which the production areas are established. So we're passing, and this edict is really the point, the hinge of the transition between wines determined by type and wines determined by origin. And we are in 1716. How far have we gone? Well, we are in the middle, 1716, and this is like saying, a very important thing because it's really the first appellation in the history of wine, of humanity basically. It kind of started from there. A lot of things started, for example, in the middle of the 19th century in Bordeaux. Does something, i.e. Louis Napoleon, the one who would later become Napoleon III. For the Paris Expo of that year, they decides that we have to regulate and establish the quality of the wines that were produced by the various chateaux in Bordeaux. Why Bordeaux and why Chateau? Bordeaux is in Aquitaine. It is the Bordeaux area. And Aquitaine was under English rule for many centuries. The English had made the manufactures. The Industrial Revolution was slightly earlier than other places of Europe. And many non-noble people were beginning to have the money to be able to access the consumption that until then only the nobles had had, including quality wine. So not the wine that was bought there, but quality wines. Then in England, wine, yes, it was made, but it was not so common. It was always a luxury consumption somehow. And if you go to London, you see how much a bottle of wine costs in any London restaurant or wine shop compared to what it costs here. Much more because they have taxes, because there is transportation, because it's everything, almost everything in short, except some small production in the south. But it's almost all imported English wine. In fact, the English are the quintessential customers of the wine market. They practically invented it. And what happened? That in Bordeaux, they were bottling, but they were going directly the barrels to England. Why the barrels? What are barriques? They are 225-liter barrels. And why did they use barriques? Because they could be moved in two people, rolled, loaded on the ship. From Bordeaux, there's the port. And from Bordeaux, they would get to England quite easily. So it was a matter of practicality. It wasn't about giving the wine a wooden aroma. It had nothing to do with it. It had to do with the ease of transportation. And the barriche was that two people could handle it and load it on a boat, on a ship, on whatever it was that you had to do in short, basically. Then it was bottled in England, and in England all kinds of things were happening because there were those who cut, there were wines from other areas and so on and so forth. However, it was the wine that was also a bit of a typology. Louis Napoleon says, no, we do the universal exposition. We have to have very specific ideas about these things here. So he brings together a group of experts, the courtiers who were the brokers, the wine merchants, the ones who then sold the wine to their English co-recipes, and says you must create a value classification of the various chateau products. What were chateaus? They were 18th century villas with vineyards around them. If you go to Bordeaux, you will find Chateau Margaux, Chateau Lafite, which is now owned by the Rothschilds. In short, it's these things here. And Bordeaux wine was born in that period, basically, as well as Champagne. They were born in that period there. Modern wines don't have this long tradition. It will be 3 centuries that they are making wines, as we know them today, bottled in glass and so on, with the label. And I mean, what do these courtiers, these judges, these selectors determine? That in short, the wines, the ones that were able to fetch the highest price were better. So the Premier Crus of Bordeaux, the most important wines, which at that time were 4, Chateau Lafite, Chateau Latour, Chateau Margaux and Chateau Aubriand, all of them in the Omdoc area, except Aubriand, which is in the Graves under Bordeaux. The ones there were the ones that were popping the highest prices in the English market, and so they must have been better. And so on, and the ones that were cheaper were the Saint-Quentin Cru. And that's the very mercantile, very pragmatic classification I would say made by French merchants and for the English market, which was itself a very pragmatic market. So if I pay more, it means the thing is better, simple as that. We may disagree sometimes, but look, that very often that is the case. And the market is about perceived quality and not just intrinsic quality. So perceived quality is what makes a Ferrari cost more than a Honda of the same kind. Because Ferrari is Ferrari and Honda is not. Even if it has better performance, costs less, etc., etc. However, Ferrari is Ferrari, so the perceived quality is the brand, just to make a point. Well, we arrived at 1855. At the same time, a gentleman by the name of Bettino Ricasoli, in Broglio proper, dictated the recipe for Chianti. And that is Sangiovese, and with a few other things in the case, specifically Canaiolo and Malvasia Malvagia, as he called it, which then changed a little bit over time, but basically it's this thing, Sangiovese, because Sangiovese, the grape varieties are not the vineyards, which is always wrong. The vineyard is the vines, the grape variety is the type of grapes. So the grape variety is Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Glera Chardonnay, Montepulciano, all these are grape varieties, therefore qualities of grapes. While vineyards are the vineyards, they are the vineyards. Well, modern grape varieties did not exist. That is, modern grape varieties go through the Middle Ages, but basically we have news of Sangiovese starting between the 16th and 17th centuries, not before. Before that, we didn't really know what they were growing, and probably these vines came either from outside. So always brought by monks to make wine for mass. Think that Sangiovese has genetic kinship with Nerello Mascalese, Frappato, and Nero d'Avola, which are three Sicilian grape varieties, how it got from Sicily to Romagna and Tuscany is not well known. However, it appears in the Casentino area and on the other side in the Modigliana area, more or less in Romagna, Tuscany, between the 16th and 17th centuries. Before that, there was never any mention of Sangiovese anywhere, but so is Nebbiolo, that is, all the grape varieties. Modern are probably the result of natural crosses between local wild varieties and ancient Roman vines. The Roman Minea Gemina gave rise to Greco and Asprigno, for example. So Aglianico is probably a twist on the Hellenic name. So it is something that either came from Greece or resembled Greek wines, like Greco, which is not Greek at all. It is a Minea Gemina, so it comes from a Roman variety. However, typologically it resembled Greek wines, so it was Greek as well, because it was the typology clearly, not the origin. All right, let's move on. Let's move on and get almost to the present day, because if we have to talk about origin, well, then we have to define it better. And not just define it, self-define it, but define it by a state law. And from the end of the 19th century until 1963 in Italy, there is a tremendous battle between those who wanted to support the typological theory, and especially the merchants who wanted to have an enlarged base to be able to source product, resell it, and those who instead produced the winemakers, who could also be nobles or sharecroppers, and yet they wanted to enhance the area of origin. All of the delay that there was in the definition of the 1930 law of 1963 that established controlled appellations of origin in Italy was determined by this. In all areas of Italy there has been this tremendous battle where there were two conflicting interests and you couldn't find a square. Even in France there was, but the French were quicker, and so they made their law of a police of control origin in 1939, so before the Second World War. Then throw in that there was the pandemic phylloxeric in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So a large part of the vineyards were destroyed by this pest during that period there. Then we discovered that all we had to do was graft the aerial part of our vines onto the roots of the American vine, which was immune to phylloxera instead. And so the grafts, the mass, were born. Today the vineyards are like this, almost all, except in very few areas. There have been 2 world wars, of course, and so all of that determined different priorities than to make the law on appellations of origin. But since 1933 we have it, and we have the first DOC wines from 66 on, because it took 3 years to start defining the various zones, the first zones. So DOC wines, before that there were typical wines, but the problem was much less serious. At this point they become DOC wines. And there also begins to be an international trade in wines from areas that were not so well known before. Because yes, of course, Taurasi, yes, of course, different wines are also being born. Amarone della Valpolicella is a modern wine. It is a modern wine because it is the result of a mistake, probably like the Cotato Pol in Jerez of the Frontier. Amarone, why is it called Amarone? In Veneto, Amaro is the equivalent of dry. It is not bitter, it's the opposite of sweet. And they used to make a sweet wine that was Recioto Classico della Valpolicella. It was a wine made from raisin grapes. And at some point you don't really know whether in the Negra Cooperative Winery at Bollas or Bertani's, everybody says he invented it. A barrel of classic Recioto finishes fermenting, and the wine becomes dry. It became bitter, hence Amarone. The Amarone Recioto, the dry Recioto. And this happens between the 1940s and the 1950s of the last century. So it's a very modern wine. We're not talking about the Chianti that already existed in 1716, or Pomino or Carmignano, or of Vernaccia di San Gimignano and quant else. We are talking about a wine that was born in that period there, Brunello di Montalcino itself. It's something from the late 19th century, and nobody knew about it. Brunello di Montalcino became world famous after the DOC law, because before it was a local wine, 3 or 4 made it. Today there are 300 producers of Brunello di Montalcino, just to give you an idea. Brunello di Montalcino is produced in 12 million bottles every year, and more than 80% of it is exported. It is not the only case. Barolo is the same, Amarone is the same. That is, great Italian wines are 80% exported at present, and we are the biggest exporters in quantity that there are in the world. So Italian wine is the most exported wine. It is not the most expensive wine. The French export half and have more than our sales. You think that one for the other, we make about 50 million hectoliters a year, and we make about 16 billion euros refilled, which means that roughly a liter of Italian wine is worth 3 euros. The French, with the same amount, make 37 billion. So a liter of French wine is worth almost 7 euros. How come? They started earlier and did a branding operation. That is, they created the brand. Champagne is one of the most classic examples. Then we came to appellations of origin, and appellations of origin become local appellations, and precisely the origin is established. It is focused. The typology is almost gone. Now the appellation of origin somehow destroys instead the concept of typological wine. And the further we go, the more this is focused. In the birth of dosages, which means appellation of controlled and guaranteed origin. Guaranteed by what? by the state through tighter controls, through stricter production specifications, and through the awarding of a state stamp that has the value of a banknote, basically, because it is printed at the state mint, it is numbered, there is really a state seal. If you go and look at the DOCG bottles in Tuscany, there are many. Besides all the Chianti Classico, Brunello, Vernaccia di San Gimignano, Carmignano, there are quite a few DOCG wines. And you find this seal. This seal is awarded after the wine has passed chemical analysis, clearly, so it has to meet certain production parameters, and it also has to pass the judgment of a tasting committee. That has to say that this wine corresponds to what it is supposed to be. And it's a committee made up of winemakers, obviously, and every production consortium has tasting committees that meet. And every producer, in order to get the DOCG label, has to submit all the batches that he wants to bottle to this kind of analysis. So it's a pretty serious thing for my colleagues on report. It is a serious thing. It is a very controlled thing. You think that wine producers in Italy today can have controls from 11 different bodies, namely the ASLA, the forestry controls of all types, the fire brigade, all of them, also because many of them go to check, and after that, of course, the producer gives them a bottle. So they are happy. They combine business with pleasure somehow. I see a few friends here who are in wineries, and they know very well how things work. But these are, shall we say, are venial sins, fortunately. It's also nice to let people taste that then maybe they come there not in the guise of those who want to destroy, but because they spend a day in the country, it's a nice thing. It is difficult, for example, in Tuscany to have. Of course, there have been some very bad incidents, like the methanol incident, for example, which in 1886 resulted in the death of many people and the blindness of many people. What is methanol? Methanol is methyl alcohol. Methyl alcohol is also produced by trace alcohol fermentation normally, and it does no harm there. Ethyl alcohol is the basic alcohol in wine, but it is not the only alcohol in wine, because there is also glycerol, for example, which is a trivalent alcohol and is produced during alcoholic fermentation. There is also some methanol, however, some criminal scoundrels, I don't know what else to call them, murderers even, thought, well, since they had some wine that could not be called wine because it had too low an alcohol content, so think what it was supposed to be, to add alcoholic gradation through precisely the use not of ethyl alcohol but of methyl alcohol, because it cost less, and therefore without really knowing what they were doing. And so this poison went on the market that killed all these poor people and resulted in, you think, in 1 year, the halving of Italian wine exports. Think that even there were, that is, Italian wine could not go abroad unless there were analyses done by every single country on every batch of wine that was exported. From 19 million hectoliters of exports, we went to 10 million hectoliters of exports in 1 year. A tragedy even from the point of view, certainly less important, obviously, of people's lives, but a tragedy also from the commercial and image point of view of Italian wine in the world. You can imagine the French, the Spanish, what they said and what they did, of course, and think that at that same time Renzo Arbore was doing an advertisement in which he said beer and you know what you drink. Not him, but the brewers, I would say. How can you say, call this thing looting, can you say? I mean, it was a bad thing. I mean, bad episode, terrible, dramatic. These were criminals, but it was all in all a fairly limited phenomenon compared to then the lives of people. 1 or a million is the same thing. I don't mean that. But they were not. I mean, the vast majority of Italian wine producers were good people. They were people who did their job well. The wines were okay. There was nothing wrong with them, however. They played it against us in a very heavy way. Having said that, what time is it? We still have about 10 minutes left. And I can tell you some more about the wine. I hope I haven't bored you so far. But in short, think as far as it is the focus of type of origin, that there are not only in Italy, but even in Burgundy, let's not talk about it, wines that do not bear the name of the region or the municipality, but the name of the vineyard. If I were to tell you Chambertin, Chambertin is a wine produced in the commune of Gevrey-Chambertin from the vineyard that is called Chambertin, just that vineyard there, which will be 5 hectares if I'm not mistaken, which is owned by different vignerons, winemakers in Burgundy. It is made from black pine, and it is produced only there. But there would be Manet and Contilly, the same thing, and the same chateau in Bordeaux do not have the name Bordeaux on the label. They have the name of the chateau, Chateau Margaux. Yes, Margaux is a commune in Bordeaux, but Chateau Lafite, which is in Pauillac, does not say Pauillac either. It says Pauillac appellation of origin. It doesn't say Bordeaux. So either you know that that is a Bordeaux wine made with Cabernet Sauvignon in large part, or maybe you shouldn't be drinking it, or you buy it because it is so iconic in that respect that, in short, if you don't know, you don't need to drink it. I mean, you don't care, so that's fine. With all the right to do that, for goodness sake. And lately, within some appellations of origin, sub-areas have come up. The additional geographical mentions in the Langhe, in Barolo and Barbaresco, and additional geographical units in the Chianti Classico area. What are they? The Chianti Classico zone are the municipal appellations, basically. So it says Chianti Classico, and under Castelnuovo Beraddenga it says Greve in Chianti, Castellina in Chianti, Vagliagli, Rada in Chianti, and so on and so forth, all of them. San Donato, and so on and so forth. So it is Chianti Classico, but it comes from the vineyards that are located in that municipality there. In the Langhe area, even there is not the name of the municipality, but there is the name of the vineyards. So there is Canubi, Vignarionda, Barolo, Vignarionda, Canubi, Barolo, Brunate, and each vineyard, kind of like what happens in Burgundy, each vineyard is placed in a determination. Meanwhile, there is the territorial definition of the vineyard, and then there is also the location within a particular commune. So one knows that Busia is in Monforte, or Vignarionda is in Serralunga d'Alba, or Canubi is in Barolo. And Brunate is between Barolo and Lamora, and Serrequi and Lamora, and so on, which are the municipalities in the area of Barolo, as is also the case in Barbaresco. So as you can see, we are getting to a definition of origin that is more and more precise, more and more specific, especially for high quality wines, because then it's not like everybody has to drink very high quality wines with exorbitant prices and so on. But this thing here creates image, so it's a branding too. The French did it first. That's why French wines cost more than Italian wines, because they defined uniqueness very specifically before we did. Why did they do that? Because we have been a nation since 1861. The French have been since the time of the Kingdom of France, after the 100 Years' War, basically. They started to be a nation state. And the market, that means at that time the domestic market was very important. The relations with England, when they weren't playing them, were very important. England had the English Empire and France was building it up. Slowly it did too. So a global market even. Here, the global market. because we talk about Italy and we think we are at the center of the world in terms of wine production. Partly true, but we produce less than 20% of the world's wine. France the same, another 20%, Spain 15%. In Europe, we make 2/3 of the world's wine, but there are countries that in recent years have become great wine producers. The United States of America is the 5th largest producer. California, but not just Napa Valley, all of California. California is as big as Turkey. It is not only Long Beach or Santa Monica or Malibu. There are mountains, there is Sierra Nevada, there is desert. There are so many aspects of climate that are very different than what we imagine of California. And California is the part of the United States that produces the most. Then Argentina. The Argentines are half Spanish and half Italian, and so they both brought the tradition of wine production. The biggest Argentine winery is called Catina, probably not a Spanish name. Just to make a point. Then Australia is becoming an incredible powerhouse. In the southeastern part of Australia, where you have Coonawarra, South Australia, Adelaide, where there is one of the largest wine research centers in the world in Adelaide. Think New Zealand is becoming very important. South Africa is a not inconsiderable wine power. So outside of Europe, we have at least 1/3 of the wine that is produced in the world. And in America in particular, it is true that we send a lot of wine to the United States. We hope to do that for many more years. But they also have their own consumption, and like to say, they really appreciate wines. The wines produced in California, but also in other areas. California is 90% of American wine, but there are also other areas, Oregon, Washington State. There are things even in New York State, so in Long Island and so on and so forth. So there are many places of production. So wine is becoming, on the one hand, a very strong focus of its origin, but also a dilation of production all over the world. And then also if you will, a focus in each country that Napa Valley has become so famous for. This is kind of what I wanted to tell you about the world of wine. We are 50 minutes into the speech, so I don't want to go over your attention span, then we'll all go for drinks, who knows. Having said that, if there are any questions, I am here, and for the time being, I thank you for your attention.